Thank you so much, Caroline, for taking the time to speak with me today. I'd love to hear first off a bit about how this piece of research came about.
Well, as a research communications manager, I believe that one of the greatest impacts that can come from any piece of research is actually having an influence on the laws and policies that shape our daily lives and society. And yet I felt there was this real knowledge gap about where policymakers actually look for evidence-based information. What are the most effective channels of reaching them? So this makes it very difficult to plan effective policy engagement, and that's a real problem if, like me, you have very limited resource for policy engagement activities. This is something that has to be fitted in around core duties. The manpower is limited, you have limited time. So there's a need to focus your time, your energy, but you don't know what channels to focus this on. So I felt that many might be in the same position as myself. So when I saw the Chartered Institute of Public Relations call for proposals for their 2023 research grant programme, I thought it would make a worthwhile topic.
Wonderful. Yeah, it certainly is. And the report that you've written off the back of the research is absolutely fascinating, really well researched, and some amazing case studies and survey responses in there. So really encourage people to dig into that. But I think before we talk about the findings, it would be really helpful initially actually to start from the beginning and find out what do you mean when you refer to policymakers? Because I think most people would immediately just think of probably MPs here in the UK in particular. But it's kind of broader than that, isn't it? Who are you talking to, and who was your sort of target for this research?
So I took a very broad approach, and policymaker could mean government department staff of select committees, local government councillors or policy officers, members of a devolved legislature, and the wider civil service. Because as you say, the MPs, the Lords, might be the ones on television, but there is actually a huge army of policymakers behind the scenes who do a lot of the actual work.
Could you paint a bit of a picture about what life is like for these policymakers? What kind of work environments are they living in? And how does that impact the way in which that they're able to consume and digest research as it comes through and information that's made available to them?
Well, the two key things that stood out here was, first of all, a complete lack of time, or being incredibly time pressured. It's probably best summarised by one of the quotes from the participants. If I'm reading a report, it's in the gaps between meetings, late at night on my tablet, or while travelling. So I really need to be able to just skim and get to the bits I'm interested in. So it doesn't paint a particularly nice picture that you haven't got the luxury of an extended period of time to really get to grips with information, do a leisurely search. It's really pressured. And so there is that always deadlines looming and the obligation to return information as soon as possible. And on top of this, they are literally being bombarded with information from all directions, people who want to make them aware of their new research, people who are lobbying, all sorts of things. So they've got this twin challenge, really, of having things coming at them from all angles and just being incredibly pressed for time. So that means you just cannot afford to direct them to research and make them do the work of working out what it's about. You have to be completely upfront and explain to them what it is about, so they can assess instantly whether it's useful for their particular purpose at the time.
And how might they be using research sort of on a regular daily basis in informing their decisions?
So this was one of the questions I asked in the online survey that was part of this research, and the top reasons that they were using research were to learn more about an area of research, to inform a new policy, to evaluate existing policies, and to produce briefing papers or research summaries. And some more minor reasons included help to prepare speeches, to evaluate the delivery of projects, and possibly my favourite, to evaluate whether I'm being told the truth by politically motivated actors.
So what did you learn about sort of how well informed these policymakers are likely to be on the specific topics that they're researching. Do they differ much from other audiences that researchers typically might be looking to engage with in terms of their sort of prior understanding of their subject areas?
I'd say policymakers are a really interesting group in this respect, because often they have to be almost like specialist generalists. They're expected to have a very broad knowledge across a wide range of subjects, particularly when you consider the diversity of topics that might be dealt with in a single parliamentary cycle. And of course, the pace at which things change, they might suddenly have to completely switch and get up to speed on an entirely new area. But for those that end up working on a specific topic for a very extended period of time, for instance, on a select committee inquiry that might go on for several months, they may actually become quite expert themselves. And interestingly, this research revealed that although policymakers liked executive summaries, they liked simple explanations, things to be in accessible language, they also appreciated having links to the original data, so that there was this capacity to do a deeper dive or investigate further. So this suggests that they often ended up being highly familiar and expert with the topic in question.
So how does that feed into how researchers should consider how they are communicating their work when it comes to engaging with policymakers? If there is this quite wide variation in terms of sort of existing knowledge and specialism in the topic areas, what would your recommendations be for researchers who are looking to engage at a certain level? What level should they be pitching at, or are there any kind of methods of communication that policymakers said that they appreciated that could help?
Well, I think the one thing that unites policymakers, regardless of how much prior knowledge they have, is wanting to understand the impact in real-world terms. So how does it actually affect people's daily lives? What are the impacts at, say, economic or social level? So putting it in the wider context of those factors and the political landscape, bearing in mind that your research evidence is just one part of a bigger picture that they will have to consider. So being mindful of that and addressing those concerns up front is very important in making it as useful as possible to all policymakers, regardless of whether they're a generalist or an expert.
One of the other things that I recall mentioning in the report is that many said that they really appreciate sort of policy recommendations being attached to the research itself. That struck me as something that perhaps researchers and people who are communicating research might not have that much experience of having to formulate. So, in some ways, it might feel somewhat beyond the remit of researchers who are kind of gathering the data and so on, but then making policy recommendations might well feel somewhat unfamiliar for many. So what would you suggest in response to that request?
I'd say that I think a lot of researchers are put off from making policy recommendations because they don't want to be seen as advocating a particular source of action or lobbying. But that's not necessarily what making recommendations has to be. You could simply set out the different options and what the evidence says in terms of whether they are likely to succeed or not, or evidence suggests that if this course of action was taken, the impacts might be. So it doesn't necessarily have to be hardcore lobbying. It could just be setting out what the evidence indicates. I would say that a good thing to do is just read really good examples of briefing notes that do this. For instance, those produced by the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. These are very good at succinctly setting out the different options to address certain challenges and the evidence of how they might work out. A lot of respondents also mentioned that they found case studies really valuable as it enabled them to see how a policy might work in their specific practice. So backing up a suggested policy with examples of it already working or not elsewhere can be an extremely powerful argument.
Wonderful. And are there certain types of research that are more likely to be getting used by policymakers? I mean, I suppose sort of the social sciences spring to mind, as perhaps areas where, when they're coming to formulate new approaches to housing or whatever the issue might be, that research is going to come into play. Are there certain researchers in certain fields who probably should be sort of a bit more proactive about trying to get their work seen by policymakers than others, or are they sort of, digesting research from across all different disciplines, do you find?
I think it's not so much the discipline or what department or institute it's coming from that's important. It's more being absolutely clear why it's relevant and why now. I remember some of the case studies indicated that they just kept getting sent huge chunky reports that just come out, landing on their desks. No explanation as to why they should read it, why it was relevant, and they just got ignored, thrown on the pile is what one of them said. So it's very important to be strategic and really explain why it's relevant, particularly if it relates to a topic that's currently in parliamentary business. So it may be that when you first produce your report or whatever, that context isn't quite there for it to get that notice. But then something happens in the wider media, a debate is chaired for a new law that is relevant, and then that's the moment when you can send it to the policymaker with the cover note saying, this debate is coming up, this is important for these reasons, summarise the research. So I'd say it's not so much the discipline, but making it relevant to current events is what ensures that policymakers will read it. Another thing which came across as something that made research outputs stand out is the opportunity to follow up with the authors. There was this real desire to be able to have direct conversations with experts. I particularly liked one quote, which was, "I want fewer briefing papers and more chats." So including contact details, making yourself available and accessible for people to contact you directly could also be another way to stand out when it comes to presenting evidence to policymakers.
So we sort of touched there, I suppose, on we've discussed a bit about what kind of communication works and how policymakers like the research to be sort of packaged, I guess, in that sense. But in terms of sort of getting it to them, as you mentioned, just sending a big fat research paper without any sense of the context is not particularly helpful. How are they consuming research? What kind of platforms and methods are they using? And how, if you really have this absolutely fantastic piece of research that you feel is very relevant to something that's going on at the moment, how can you ensure that it's going to get seen by the right people?
So the key finding from this was that by far and away, search engines and Google were the main way that they initially started looking for evidence-based information. So just under 80% use Google nearly always or often when searching for evidence-based information. And other popular sources included mainstream media, industry publications, reports from think tanks, and so on. So this suggests that policy engagement should have quite a wide lens, as just about anything you can do to make yourself more visible online and more searchable can help your information be found by people in policymaking roles. Another interesting result was that parliamentary services, such as the House of Commons Library, although they weren't used by everyone, the people who did use them seemed to use them quite a lot and really trusted them. So engaging with those services could also be another valuable approach.
So beyond the issues that we've already discussed, was there anything else that came up through the case studies and the survey as sort of hindrances to policymakers being able to use research effectively?
So a big one here was the information not being accessible or hidden behind paywalls, or they had to go through sign-up procedures and give their email and date of birth and whatever to sign up to some platform. So first of all, that's putting up time barriers, and we know how time-pressed policymakers are. And also, policymakers don't generally have subscriptions to academic journals. So you can't afford to just publish your study in your peer-reviewed academic journal and think, oh, job done, it's out there, they can find it on Google Scholar. So it really does pay to invest the time in producing more lay summaries, for instance, summarising a news item on the department's website. And several participants mentioned things like The Conversation, so news outlets where researchers can publish articles for a general audience. So if your work is behind a paywall, it has a very small chance of being accessed or read by policymakers.
What are your plans next for this? Is there more sort of research planned? How would you like this particular study to be used going forward?
Really, what I intended was that this would be a best practice guide to inform how research is communicated to policymakers. So in the report, there's some top tips at the end for communications professionals or any researchers hoping to raise awareness about their work to policy audiences. So at the moment, I'm trying to raise as much awareness as possible, particularly in research communications communities. So please do read it and please do share with your own networks. Ultimately, I would love it if this could help improve the way that evidence is communicated to policymakers so that the policies and laws that we live by are actually informed by the best available evidence.